even if you don't have any more glucose, you can make glucose with lactate, and then we make glycogen with glucose. And so, like you said, the lactate plays a central role, whether it's instantaneously in the energetic process, but also on the back end. If you need something else that's not available, lactate can probably kind of put it together for you in one way or another.
Yeah, and a concept I was turned on to, I know you had Andre Feldman on recently. His father, Jörg Feldman, has put out tons and tons of content over the past decade or so. And the first time I'd gotten turned on to, I already knew that lactate wasn't a fatigue byproduct, but I'd never really considered things like cooldowns,
Mm.
cooling down. Like, why do we do it? I never really questioned it that much. I came up as a track and field athlete, so it's just something we did after our hard workouts. In reading some of the things Jörg had written, he's like, okay, well, why do we do cooldowns? Let's look back into the history of it. Well, the reason that we do active cooldowns and active recovery after our hard training sessions is to clear lactate. At the time when these protocols were created, that was when lactate was still believed to be a fatigue byproduct or a poisonous metabolite.
Mm.
So, of course, if you measure an athlete post-workout, and then you have them do an active recovery and you see their lactate level is lower, you'd be like, victory, we got their lactate down, now they're going to recover quicker. But the interesting thing is, if you actually look at the applied sports science literature, active recoveries don't actually outperform passive recoveries. And in a lot of instances, you see that performance is greater the next day when you don't do an active recovery, and muscle glycogen concentration is actually higher as well.
Mm.
This gets into that idea of, well, lactate is going to be oxidized to resynthesize glycogen. So if you're doing your active recovery specifically to clear lactate, it's a little bit misguided. And that doesn't mean that there's no value in an active recovery, because maybe we want to do it to clear excess CO2, but it opens the door for other possibilities of like, maybe for your cool down, don't go for an easy jog, lay down on your back and do breathing drills to try and offload excess CO2 to clear that and leave the
Mm.
lactate in circulation so it can be oxidized. So I think it opens all kind of doors for different ways of approaching training with methods that through a traditional lens you wouldn't really think make sense.
Mm.
But we never really go back and question these things like, oh, we both know lactate doesn't do what it's said to do, but I still cool down and I still have people cool down. So it's like, maybe those are things that we could start questioning as well. And perhaps that actually is better performance outcomes. I don't know.
Is it, to put it a little bit differently, is it that essentially, well, you accumulate lactate when you're, let's say, pushing a certain level of intensity on any given modality, you start accumulating lactate. And then if you do cool down, and I remember seeing that in one of Andrew's videos where he was talking about essentially the rest time between sprint bouts, and the passive recovery folks had better performances on subsequent intervals than the active recovery ones. Is it simply that you're actually just essentially using more energy to do your cool down because the energy has to come from somewhere, right? There's no free lunch. So even on a cool down, even though the intensity is maybe 10%, 20% of what you did previously, it's still more work that you have to do compared to doing no work. So is it just that, hey, we're just essentially we're still pulling money out of the bank, but just a lot slower, but we're still pulling money out instead of trying to put it back in, which I guess just takes its own time. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is what makes Moxie so nice. Is like with Moxie, we don't need to think about any of these things with lactate and getting into the fancy bioenergetics. Like, we know muscle oxygen saturation is important for doing work. You could very clearly see if you're doing active recovery between work bouts that you're not restoring oxygen saturation to the muscle. So of course you're not going to do as much work. And this could
Mm.
even factor into that critical power idea, because we know that W prime, that work that you could do above critical power, could be reconstituted. So it could recharge when you're actually operating under critical power.
Okay.
Well, if you're doing like sprint, completely rest, sprint, completely rest, you could reconstitute your W prime. But if you're doing an active rest, you're running like a sprint and then jog, you might not be reconstituting that work that is finite as quickly. So either way that you think about it in terms of lactate or critical power or just muscle oxygen saturation, all of those things would very clearly point to the fact that, like, hey, maybe it doesn't really make sense to approach things that way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned breathing before. Is that something you recommend to all your athletes? Is it only kind of situational and depending on the context? Could, anybody benefit from some type of breathing cool down, maybe even in the warm up, depending on their needs? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so I think it could be useful for everyone if done appropriately, but I think a lot of athletes, because I primarily work with remote clients and a lot of my athletes are international, so I don't really have hands-on touches with them. There's always some athletes that tend to overcomplicate things quite a bit, and it could almost be to their detriment. So I've worked with a lot of athletes who are very talented, and they just do things correctly automatically. But when you give them a cue or you tell them like manipulate your breathing in this way, it almost messes up their performance because they're thinking about too many things and it like throws a wrench in the gear. So for athletes like that, I usually just let them do their thing. I'm like, let's build the physiology in their training, take care of underlying limitations, and then
Mhm.
just let them like go and jam and like have at it. Other athletes that tend to be more receptive to feedback and don't get like paralysis by analysis, those are the ones that I tend to implement more of those things in their training. And then of course, if I can get on site access with someone, that allows us to implement a lot more than we could do remotely as well.
And when you talk about cool down and maybe substituting some breathing for some active recovery, what type of I guess sequences of breathing do you usually recommend there? Is there kind of a standard that you go with, or does that change from person to person?
Yeah, I think that's going to change from person to person and session to session as well. So one of the examples that I was talking about before is if we're doing what I'd call like extended desaturation training, so a lot of volume in a deoxygenated state where we're almost eliciting a respiratory limitation. There's a lot of CO2 that hasn't been cleared. During the quote unquote cool down, I might give someone like hypocapnic breathing, where they're intentionally breathing in a way that they're going to breathe off too much CO2 so they're able to clear it. So they're going to be taking really deep exhale, or I guess you can't take a deep exhale. You're going to be forcefully exhaling and taking deep inhales. So you're breathing off that CO2 versus hypoxic breathing, which a lot of people are probably familiar with, where you're taking deep inhales and taking very shallow exhales and you're not breathing off your CO2. It's almost the opposite of something like a Wim Hof protocol.
Mhm. And what do those different approaches have as an effect? And what does the difference have to be between the inhale and the exhale for it to be kind of significant? Is it like you want a 6 second exhale and then a 3 second inhale, kind of a 2 to 1 ratio? How do you organize that?
So I like to think about it both in terms of time, but also volume, because you can imagine someone, you're like, take a 6 second inhale and a 3 second exhale, and they take this huge long inhale and they take a 3 second exhale, but instead of being a full exhalation in 3 seconds, they just do half of the volume of the inhale.
Hmm.
So I'll typically cue people both in terms of time per breath and also volume. So people would know, okay, you're doing a 6 second inhale and a 3 second exhale, but you're still exhaling the same volume in that 3 seconds. So it's very forced. So there's different ways of manipulating it like that.
I remember Aaron Davis talking about some CO2 protocols that he was using with his athletes. He talked about altitude mask and how he might recommend someone wear it actually at home when they're not doing anything between
Mhm.
training sessions. Have you played with any of that?
No, I haven't played with that too much.
Yeah,
I tend
it's
to probably get a different demographic, just knowing like the kind of people Aaron works with, where a lot of the people that I work with, they are already very CO2 tolerant because they're CrossFitters who do a ton of what we would traditionally call anaerobic work. Obviously, it's not anaerobic. So I've seen things like that being detrimental in those populations, but I could see
mhm.
something like that being really effective with endurance athletes, gen pop clients, things like that.
Yeah, so maybe let's go into that just a little bit because you've made a video on nasal breathing and talked about why maybe for mostly, like you said, the population you work with, CrossFitters, that might not be the best thing to do because they're already very CO2 tolerant.
Mhm.
So in which specific cases might it be a good idea to include some, for example, nasal breathing on some long, steady state cardio in training for?
Yes, I think the people that I'd use that with, one is going to be people that have trouble with maintaining proper breathing mechanics, because nasal breathing is reflexively tied to diaphragmatic breathing. So it's a really easy way to cue proper breathing mechanics. People with allergies, asthma, that will be effective as well. And also a lot of the endurance athletes that I work with some ultra marathoners who don't really do a lot of high intensity work.
Mm,
So something that could increase their CO2 tolerance will be effective for them because they're not doing this HIIT training or work where they're getting extended desaturation, having to deal with breathing off excess CO2. Also with like military populations who tend to do more of that longer volume work with less intensity, I'll use that as well.
Mm.
But it's not something I typically use with a lot of CrossFitters, just because I find that they already under breathe in most instances. So they're already getting an excess buildup of CO2. So we actually want them to breathe more and breathe greater volumes.